one of the things that's very difficult to get your hands around is how you would evaluate the risk of enhanced disease following vaccination for a disease that has so many different manifestations. So what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction to this topic and then turn this over to Paul-Henri, who's really we're very privileged to have who will give an expert discussion there. So overview, just give a brief definition of what we're talking about and sort of set the stage as to where we are. I mean, there were no human vaccine trials for SARS-CoV-1 and for MERS, there are trials actually now either beginning or taking place. So most of the data that's available is from animal models. People, two different classes of animal models we'll be talking about, the small animal models and also non-human primates. Next slide. Next slide. So one, you can see enhanced disease severity in vaccinees when they're exposed to wild-type virus. And the one we all remember the best, at least the pediatric ID people, is the formalin inactivated RSV vaccine, where not only were the children more have more severe disease manifestations, but had deaths in that group following exposure to wild-type virus. So this is something obviously we don't want to see. But you can also see an increased risk of infection following vaccination. And an example of this is an Ad5 HIV vaccine, where recipients were more likely to be infected than people who received the placebo. Next slide. So just so you know, Cepi and some of you are involved in this, sponsored a 2-day video conference that was organized by Speak last month with the goal of advising Cepi-sponsored developers and others as to how to evaluate the risk of enhanced disease and how to minimize that risk with their vaccine candidates. And for those of you who are interested in hearing more, there are videos of the meeting and the slide presentations are available, and just let us know and we can provide a link to that. Next slide. So Paul-Henri will talk about this in more detail, but basically this is a slide that from a publication that's in development by Donna Ambrosino and our group to summarize the data from animal studies amongst one component of it. And what you can see here is that there's several different vaccine candidates that exhibited enhanced immunopathology in the animals after challenge. Importantly, most of them were directed against the N protein rather than the S spike protein, although there's one there that also had replicon particles expressing S protein, and some of them were associated with alum adjuvant and the type of immune response that's elucidated there. Next slide. So the reason we're talking about this and the reason we want you to be aware of it, because it's going to be one of the main safety issues that you will have to address during your deliberations on COVID DSMB committees, is that some animal models with some vaccine constructs have shown immunopathology after exposure to wild-type virus in animals. And vaccine development programs have to take this into account and are taking it into account. And importantly, we'll hear from Flor Munoz later, speak as a working group that she's leading to develop a Brighton case definition for enhanced disease. And unlike a case definition for Guillain-Barré or for seizures or whatever, it's not just one clinical entity, it's multiple clinical entities, and it's a qualitative increase in severity. So it makes the case definition development very complicated, I think it's fair to say. And Paul-Henri will be discussing this later, and I think this is a good segue if we can have the next slide to introduce him. Paul-Henri, if you would like to proceed.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. So clearly, as you mentioned, Steve, one reason why we are a bit scared to have an enhanced disease with a SARS-2 vaccine is that we know that if you would have such an effect, it can be dramatic and could have a fantastic impact. And we are living with the example of RSV, where the formalin activated virus vaccine was formulated in alum, and it was inducing antibodies, but low neutralizing antibody responses and high binding antibody responses detected by ELISA. There was also a waning of antibodies, and in fact, the enhanced disease was seen only several months after immunization at the time of exposure, and this may be a lesson for us as well. The problem was seen in a very young age, and this was certainly favoring in human a Th2 biased response. This is something that we may escape with COVID. And then obviously we have seen, as well known, that we had this high rate of hospitalization in the vaccinated children and even 2 fatalities. The question that I have is that if at the time of the development of RSV vaccine, we would have seen what happened in animal models like cotton rat and mice with an enhancement of disease that could be detected, would that change the picture? It would probably alerted investigators, but maybe not change anything. But that's something to keep in mind. Next. So as we heard this beautiful talk on COVID-19, COVID-19 appears as a two-stage disease. And in the first being the acute phase, in the second phase, this is when we see the severe manifestations, and these manifestations are associated with acute innate immunity, but also incipient adaptive immunity. We have quite a lot of antibodies, and that there is even a trend to have more antibodies in the people with severe disease than in the mild cases. So many indications, there is quite a lot of indication suggesting that the severe disease is associated with immunopathology. We have high antibody levels, we have inflammatory infiltrates, including activated T cells, a cytokine storm. And in addition, we know that with other corona vaccine candidates, with SARS and with MERS, there was enhanced disease in animal models. So far, we don't have any human data. Next. So with all the COVID-19 vaccine, which are now in development, we would obviously expect a protection against infection, protection against severe disease, a long-lasting protection, and a reduced transmission. But what we don't want is an incomplete protection with an increased clinical expression of infection in younger adults and children, with an increased incidence of severe disease in infected individuals of all ages, an increased severity of disease in the older adults, or extrapulmonary immunopathology. And this is an aspect which I will discuss later because it's clearly expanding today. Next. So what are the potential mechanisms of enhanced disease. One, this is the RSV model. We have a risk associated with Th2 biased immune responses. Secondly, we may have a risk associated with antibody-mediated immunopathology, and this can be of two types. One is related to ADE or formation of immune complexes. Second one being an inappropriate T-cell response. And then third, the risk of extrapulmonary manifestation and particularly vasculitis. Next. So here I took one example of enhanced disease that was seen with vaccine against SARS. This is a study using UV inactivated SARS vaccine with or without alum, in fact. And it was shown that this vaccine in mice that were immunized with this vaccine, there was an excessive eosinophilic infiltration after challenge. That's what we see here on the right. This is vaccinated mice as compared to the mice developing the acute disease on the left. Sure, you have congestion, you have hemorrhage, pulmonary edema, and some mononuclear cell infiltration, but nothing to compare to what we see on the right with this highly inflammatory lesions and this abundance of eosinophil. Next. In the same model, it was seen that in fact, if the same UV inactivated vaccine was mixed with TLR agonists used as adjuvant, and in this particular situation, they used LPS, poly-IC, and poly-U as adjuvant. And it was found that, in fact, this was leading to a disappearance of the eosinophil infiltration, although there is still some inflammation. And this was corresponding to moving away from the Th2 profile to a more Th1 profile with a decrease in the lung of IL-4 concentration, IL-13, eotaxin, and an increase of IP-10, which is reflecting the increase of interferon gamma. Next, please. So it's clear that in this model were used and can be used probably for SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. However, it is known that SARS-2 has a low affinity for murine S2 receptor, and this is requiring the use of human S2 transgenic and preferably using the knock-in approach. Second, in mice, it's clearly considered that the enhanced disease is a consequence of a dominant Th2 type response. It was not seen after the addition of adjuvant, and there are a number of experiments using more modern adjuvants, such as the adjuvant from GSK, the AS01 or AS03, showing that this is suppressing the eosinophilia. However, it was also observed, and partly observed, in fact, with vaccine expressing the N protein, even if they were vectored vaccine. There is no evidence of an enhanced viral replication in vivo, despite a demonstration of ADE in vitro. And the value of this model may be to give us some indication of what can be observed or can be really looked at during clinical trial. It's clear that in the model that we have here, the IgG isotype and other Th2 markers have some alerting value, and it would be worthwhile to have more extensive studies on that side. We know also that other small animal models, and particularly the ferret and the hamster, can be infected with the SARS-CoV-2, and they may be considered. These models are in fact progressing today it seems the hamster is particularly interesting. And finally, there we can say that the potential confounding effect of cell culture contaminants must be ruled out. We see quite frequently eosinophilia in mice immunized with different vaccines, which are mainly related to the presence of the same contaminant in the vaccine and in the challenge strain preparation. There is a need for purification there. Next. Now, the other group of models have been developed in non-human primates. And they are quite different. They don't show this predominance of eosinophil, but they show a risk associated with an antibody-mediated immunopathology. Now it seems that COVID-19 lung pathological features can be seen in rhesus macaques, maybe more in African green monkeys. They remain limited, but maybe in fact extremely convenient to see if you have an enhancement in this model. Next. In non-human primate, it was shown already some years ago that with SARS, there was a risk of enhanced pathology after immunization, particularly obviously, and here we see on the right what happens with using the inactivated SARS vaccine, followed by a SARS challenge. And there, this lesion appearing that can be seen even by gross anatomy. They are localized, they are not seen everywhere in the lung, and this is an important point to keep in mind. And this is associated with a major infiltration of inflammatory cell in the lesion. Next, please. Here we see, I would say, a nice experiment, which were done using more modern vaccine, using, in fact, an MVA vector representing the S protein. This is a full-length S. And this induces, as you can see under the NAP sign, an excellent neutralization antibody response. It's resulting also in a decrease of viral load after challenge with SARS, a very impressive decrease. But it's also leading to an increase of the pathology score. We see in blue what has been seen in the vaccinated NHPs as compared in white to the control. And at the bottom, we see the histopathology showing really this massive infiltration, and then which has been seen from day 6, but extending to day 35 post-infection. And here we don't see, in fact, eosinophil infiltration, but a lot of monocyte and macrophages and T cells. And this is clearly different from what is seen on the right with the control MVA monkeys. Next. Further, in the same model, in fact, when these authors picked up the plasma from these Chinese rhesus monkeys that were immunized with the vaccine, and then purified IgG from this plasma, and then treated monkeys 2 days before infection with SARS, and it was seen that there was a picture which was in fact very similar to what was seen with direct immunization. This was more important with high dose IgG. When they say high dose, that was meaning 200 milligram of IgG, as compared to the low dose, which is 5 milligram. But even with the low dose, you have lesion, and in fact, at day 35, at day 21, the lesion are even more important. So what was seen in the vaccinated monkeys could be reproduced by the passive transfer of antibody, and it's suggesting that this inflammation is linked with the formation of immune complexes locally in the lung. Next. This was seen also after passive administration of monoclonal. Here we see the use of monoclonal, which had a strong ADE effect. And this is shown on the left when they look at the neutralization, and you have a negative neutralization with this particular monoclonal. The monoclonal was injected at different dose into rhesus macaque just before exposure to SARS, to the virus. And again, they have seen with a high dose that they had larger area of necrosis, sheets of septa fusion, necrotic lesion, and massive macrophage infiltration, although the viral load was practically the same in these monkeys. So the AADE antibodies can do the job, but not by increasing the viral load. This may be a bit scaring. Fortunately, it seems that from what I heard these last days, that in patients with COVID-19, in whom convalescent plasma was transferred, so far this was not associated with a noticeable, at least, disease enhancement, knowing that it's not easy to see. Next. So if we consider the antibody-mediated mechanism, it could be first linked with ADE, but this is unlikely since we don't have this reduction of viral load in vivo. We have a reduction in the viral load and not an increase. Secondly, it can be due to immune complexes and associated pathology, and indeed viral antigen and IgG can be detected in the inflammatory lesion, as well as some neutrophil and monocyte. And following passive transfer of antibody, the enhanced disease seems to be associated with complement activation, and it is favored by low affinity antibody response. And third, it can be a T-cell dependent pathology. In fact, it can be a T-cell dependent pathology due to ADE, in the sense that ADE antibodies tend to redirect the virus from the normal target to monocyte, macrophages, and to some extent in dendritic cells. Therefore, in some ways, they favor the presentation of antigen to T cells, to specific T cells that have been induced by the vaccine. And this would be consistent with the T cell dependent inflammatory response, which is seen, and the cytokine storm. Next. So during our meeting of experts, some general considerations on these animal models were expressed. It was clearly recognized that all animal models of COVID-19, like of SARS, imperfectly reproduce the human disease, but they may be useful to assess this risk of disease enhancement. It's clear that NHP seems to be better than mice, mainly because the immune response in NHPs is much closer to human than what we have in mice. However, there is a need to standardize the NHP models because at this stage it's going in all directions. Now, this allows probably to identify potential markers of safety in NHPs, and this can include the relative level of neutralizing versus non-neutralizing antibodies, the antibody affinity, complement activation markers such as fragment of C3, T-cell response profile, cytokine and chemokines, and obviously the characterization of lung immunohistopathology and I would say the monitoring of extrapulmonary lesion. And there on the left, we see what has been seen with SARS by Stanley Polman, showing that the SARS virus enters the CNS via the olfactory bulb. And there is an infection which results in a rapid transneuronal spread. The virus can be found in the olfactory bulb, but also much further in the hypothalamus, in the thalamus, and even in the brain stem. In COVID-19, we have now very recent indication data showing that COVID-19 can be found in NHPs in the olfactory bulb. You have this particular olfactory defect, which is seen in the patient, which may be related to this kind of invasion. And this is something certainly to monitor when the vaccine will be given. Other lesions have been in some way forgotten on the way, are now being discovered. And these are lesions of vasculitis. It was published 3 days ago by a Swiss group, in fact, that they found in 3 patients at autopsy that they had disseminated vasculitis with a localization of virus in the endothelial cells. So there is a whole new picture which is opening there and will have to be looked at. Next. Which markers should we measure in phase 1 trial? Well, there was an attempt to see what should be done, what must be done, what would be informative, or what could be done later. And this was done, in fact, by Arnaud Didier-Laurent. Obviously, must do ELISA versus neutralization. Looking at the antibody affinity, knowing that low affinity is bad. Trying to have a definition of the epitope recognized by these antibodies after vaccination, mapping, looking at the repertoire, knowing that with an adjuvant we can really enlarge the breadth of the repertoire. There are now many information coming out showing that the Fc gamma receptor binding may be crucial, and things that can be done immediately as well is looking in more detail at the T-cell response, obviously. Now, what will be informative will be to look at the glycosylation of the antibodies induced with the vaccine. We know that the adjuvant can change the degree of glycosylation, and this may be important. There is the question of cross-reactivity to other coronavirus, and particularly to common cold virus. There is the question of inflammatory markers and doing the whole set of assays and microarrays to see what we have there. And then later on, obviously, biobanking can be done and do more sophisticated assays. Next. So if we consider the relevance of these animal studies for clinical development, this was extensively discussed at our meeting in March, and it was the opinion of the experts that for vaccine constructs which are likely to induce a Th2 response, like inactivated vaccine in alum, animal studies should be considered before entering into human phase 1 trial, and to do that in more than one animal species. Second, for vaccine constructs which are already known to induce neutralizing antibody and Th1 responses, there was a consensus that phase 1 studies could proceed cautiously in parallel with animal studies, and then with careful review of the safety data at the end. When feasible, it will be probably useful to have the possibility, at least even a posteriori, to look at the serostatus of participants in phase 1 studies to assess the immune response in both seronegative and seropositive. Consideration should be given to the use of post-vaccination sera from vaccinees, which could be used for antibody transfer in animals. And in fact, I just heard today that this is being done by Stanley Perlman in mice, in a mouse model, right now. And then there is a question of a longer follow-up. It's clear that you could expect that the immune enhancement would not occur immediately, but would occur 1 year later when antibodies are waning at a time of re-exposure to the disease. This would not be very practical for vaccine development to follow phase 1 during and phase 2 trial during 2 years. But for having a longer follow-up in parallel with the clinical development is something which is recommended. Next. So the concluding remark of the group of experts was that the group considered that the demonstration of some disease enhancement with any candidate vaccine after a viral challenge in animal model should not represent a no-go signal for early trials for the COVID-19 vaccine. However, a continuous monitoring of this risk during clinical trial in an epidemic context will be needed, and each observed effect should be considered by the developers and their regulators as product-specific and not generic for the type of vaccine which is being used. Thank you.
Open for comments or questions from the group.
Steve, this is Neil. I have a question, a comment, and a suggestion.
Okay.
The question
That's using up your full quota, Neil. Go ahead.
The question is, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to collect the data that you want for the case definition in patients who are severely ill. And the evidence that you're looking for is evidence of absence of neutralizing antibody or immunologic parameters collected at the time when a patient's in the hospital, potentially ventilated and so forth. Based on what I know about the RSV model and what happened is those markers were markers that were collected before the patients, after vaccination, but before exposure and in retrospect from the animal models. The comment is, I think this case definition that you're trying hard to develop is very, very different than all of the other Brighton case definitions. Because I think if we look at the cases of COVID-19 that have occurred, some of those who've never been vaccinated would probably meet your criteria. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But my suggestion is that the most important thing you can do is a severity score, because from the standpoint of the clinical trials that many of us will be serving on safety monitoring boards, we're going to be comparing the outcomes in vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And I think a very carefully done severity score is what we're going to use. I'm not sure you're going to be able to label an individual case as definite or probable or level 1 or level 2 evidence of enhanced disease. I think it's going to be a comparison of two groups.
This is Flora. Can I just say something? I really appreciate those comments, Dr. Halsey, because actually we know it's going to be very difficult. And indeed, this is a very different case definition from prior Brighton case definitions for many reasons. And the idea to make it practical at a time when we are still learning about the pathophysiology of this disease is also another challenge. So I am tapping into as many severity scores that are being used out there right now, and also any guidance, regarding identification of cases. But you do bring up a good point regarding when to collect the samples, because I guess this could make a difference in clinical trial design if one is specifically, and we discussed this as well, whether one should wait for the clinical manifestations, or if there could be surrogate laboratory findings that one could try to use and collect at specific time periods, even when there are no obvious manifestations yet.
And what about
I'll agree. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, because I think one of the things that you discussed during the meeting last month is that in phase 1 trials, there's certain types of immune profiling that you would suggest be done on the vaccine recipients before they might develop any disease.
Yes, I think that this can be done, obviously, and will be done. And if you have a vaccine which gives you a profile which is exactly the one you don't want, I think that your information may be sufficient at that stage to consider a no-go, even if it's very early in the game.
Can I ask a rather naive question? Because my understanding, as you say, this is a different definition, but some of your aspects of the definitions applied to individual patients, and some, as was suggested by Neil in a sense, were ones that could only be done by looking at multiple patients as a group. And so when you have, for example, increased frequency relative to background, you can't tell that in an individual patient.
Correct. Yes. So it is a dilemma because the issue would be the comparators, right? So increased frequency and severity. It's not just the frequency compared to a control group or compared to a background, or which is again the comment regarding not really understanding what that background is for COVID in terms of severity of disease yet, or even pathophysiology. Right. So I think one of the important points about this case definition is that even if we are able to, even if it's useful to identify certain patterns or certain, profiles, as has been said, the ultimate ascertainment of enhanced disease with a higher level of certainty, a definitive case, is going to be very difficult no matter what, because we just don't know at this point, right?
I mean, remember the goal here is to try and, as much as possible, standardize this and develop a uniform approach, so that if someone sees an elevated risk profile in one trial, that could be compared to another trial to allow things to go forward. And I think Steve Evans' point that this is an epidemiologic assessment as well as individual cases, both you and Neil made that point, is something that's made it difficult to for the group to move forward. But I think actually, Flora, I was very impressed by what you presented. Other comments or questions for Flora or Paula?
Maybe a comment on this point, Steve. Obviously, if we have a trial going on in young adults, and in which, in fact, you do not expect a high frequency, even maybe not at all, to have severe disease and severe acute respiratory manifestation, then you give your vaccine and you get more severity, but you may have also a completely different clinical picture. increasing the severity doesn't mean reproducing the disease. It may be another disease. And this, obviously, we will know later. Or I hope we will not know.
This is Kathy. One of the things also I think is going to be really important for the vaccinees in the period of their follow-up is that they will be in a setting where they can actually be evaluated quite well and expeditiously, so that they would, there would be ongoing surveillance for COVID-19. There would be the ability to come in and have these tests done. And so I think we may need to think a little bit about how we tell people what the follow-up is going to be and where, and are there restrictions about where they can go and where they need to be observed.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One thing that worries me, frankly, is that in the early phase 1 trials, you're not really likely to have epidemiologic assistance in evaluating this. So if you have one case of severe respiratory disease in a phase 1 trial, I think it's going to be challenging for meta DSMB members and DSMB members to decide what to do. Do you stop a trial with one case like that of potentially useful vaccine? Do you continue and put other people at risk? Potentially, there's no simple answer for that, and that's something to think about before you actually attend your meetings.